Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and as you can see, I've got a little tray of varied kitchen scraps. Just the stuff that was used to make up a salad, some tomato bits, some lettuce bits, some cucumber, and some other things in here. I'm going to be feeding a couple of my worm bins. The bins that we're feeding today are right here in these gray tubs with the pink plastic coverings. They're a pair of African nightcrawler systems. That's the reason you see ANC is the abbreviation that I use for African nightcrawlers. Both launched on the same day. They're 52 days of age at this point, fed 4 times now. Getting them geared up for feeding number 5 today. So I'm going to get these up on the bench, and we're going to set them up as sort of a side-by-side arrangement, the way you see them now in the frame. And we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. So now during the last check-in with 2 systems, we were feeding not only these 2, but we also fed another 2. And we even checked in on a cocoon nursery that had been running, and I felt like it was a bit much. A little bit more content than I thought was necessary to just feed all my African nightcrawler bins. So I've broke them apart. I fed the other pair of bins a couple days ago after 7 days had passed since the last feeding, and now it's been 10 days that we're getting back to feeding these little guys. These little guys were probably okay with a 10-day interval between feedings versus the other one getting fed after only 7 days, because here we put in a little bit of extra food. So all the feedings 10 days ago went out pretty evenly, and then at the end these 2 younger systems were given a little bonus extra food, a couple of whole avocados, and that's kind of how I rationalized these systems being able to withstand a slightly longer duration between their feedings. Alright, I thought I'd be able to just detach this coffee filter from the top covering newspaper real easily, but it was really adhering to it. So either way, I'm just trying to get these top coverings out of our way so we can get to work on feeding. And you know, I don't have replacement coffee filters today, or do I? Actually I do. You know what? So why don't we just keep these around? We're going to use these as supplemental bedding down in the feeding area, and we'll give them replacements because I've got a couple new coffee filters off on the side. So when I set the systems up like this, the way you see them side by side, I attempt to work on them as if I'm working on one system. So I'm going to see if I can maintain my focus and do it that way today. A lot of times I'll sort of check the edge here and then backfill the edge and go check something else, then realize, hey, we should have been checking the edge right across the board in both systems at the same time as if it was one large bin. So perhaps if I keep talking about it, maybe I'll not forget. Yeah, I guess, you know, when you've got 2 systems in front of you, and regardless of, you know, how much you're attempting to pretend that it's one large system, it's inevitable that your mind can't be tricked. And then you start focusing on one system for whatever reason as if it was just a single bin, and then that whole idea of checking them together as a single bin kind of goes out the window. Not a lot of worms on the outer edges. Oftentimes when I check the outer edges of my systems, I find even more worms on those outer edges than even down where the feedings have been getting applied for whatever reason. Perhaps it's because these systems are not quite that old yet. Maybe at some point later, as things break down further in the outer edges and maybe even some food leftovers end up working their way out there, there'll be more reason for the worms to hang out. And even on this edge, perhaps the reason for us not seeing a great number of worms is because some of the bedding is even a little bit drier than it needs to be out here. And that in itself will typically be a pretty good reason why you're not seeing worms, because some of the material is still a little bit more dry than it needs to be. I mean, you saw the plastic coverings that were draped over both of these systems, pretty thoroughly covering both to prevent the loss of any moisture to evaporation. However, on the edges, the very edges around the plastic, sometimes you get a little bit of airflow going on, but probably not enough to really make a significant difference. So I like to think that the majority of the moisture that these systems has is retained with those coverings. So here I didn't see quite as much dry material out on the outer edges I saw here in this one. But I believe that every time we encounter it and we mix it in with the surrounding damper materials, we aid in evening the moisture level of the content of the bins by doing so. And that leaves us with checking in on how their last feeding is coming along. Right down the middle, that's what those coffee filters were indicating to us, which is where we last fed. So now we get to see if there's any leftovers. If nothing else, I would assume that we're going to still see leftovers of the avocado, because in one of the bins even the avocado was breached, so they could have climbed into it and started eating it, but in the other one the shell was still intact, meaning, you know, the worms might not have even made their way into it quite yet. Well, I forgot that we added a roll and a slice of bread to each of these as well. And that's what we're seeing here, these little piles of green mold. That's just what's left of, perhaps this might have been the slice of bread and this might have been the hard roll. Here we've got a little bit more left. It's interesting because the mold draws a lot of moisture into it itself, so the mold over there is a little bit dry when you touch it. And even here we've got a pretty good sized piece of leftover. I'm trying to remember what this might have been, perhaps half of an apple. Not too surprising, in my bins apple sometimes takes a little while. Here we go, this is what I was looking for. So this must have been the system where the avocado had already been broken, permitting the worms to have easy access to the inside. And I guess that probably means once we get around to the other one, we're going to find that that one may or may not have been breached yet by the worm activity, because it because if it was still, you know, intact and the shell was still holding up, those worms are not getting through that shell unless we help them get in. Here too we've got some leftover grapes. I think a good habit is to take the grapes and break them so that they can actually get consumed, because even on a grape, that thin skin of the grape is just enough to prevent the worm access from getting in there. So we'll just help them out here and there with certain things. I don't know, I'm kind of weird with that. I like to help certain foods get to the finish line, whereas on the case of other foods, I like to just allow nature to take its own course and watch how the progress develops. Alright. Every time I see the dust flying off some mold, it just makes me worry a little bit, like maybe I shouldn't be breathing that stuff in. So we've been pretty consistent on feeding, so it would have been a roll and a slice of bread in here too. And the fact that it wasn't quite consumed yet in the other bin, it's safe to say that we're going to find similar results here. Chances are we'll probably bump into a half of an apple, maybe some grapes that we need to burst while we're at it. Presumably some worms here and there as we make our way through. And last but not least, there's going to be an avocado somewhere in here too. At this point I'm wondering, you know, is it possible that they made their way into both avocados, or could this be the system where, well, here, this has got to be the avocado. I can feel the pit is right there, see? And I think that green is just the color of the avocado itself, that's not mold. So here, they've actually made a great deal more progress. This must have been the system where the shell of the avocado, or the skin of it, whatever, was already busted, whereas that one is probably the one that was still intact, or at least it appeared that way when I placed the avocados in here. For all I know, both of them could have already had their shells broken and would have given the worms easy access to the insides. So it is kind of nice to see that they're making kind of equal progress rather than having one that still hasn't even been touched yet. So we've got ourselves a couple of bins here with a nice crevice down the middle. I want to get some bedding that I want to use for these little guys. It's over in the bucket there. I'll be right back. Alright, so A lot of times when I'm using leaves from out in the garden, I just grab my box, which is what I like to put the leaves into when I bring them in. But in this case, I collected a great deal more than I normally do. And you can even tell from the consistency of this stuff. It's a lot finer than what you normally see me pulling out of my little box. Oops. Try to keep all the material in the worm bin rather than sticking to this bucket. So I was attempting to kind of break this stuff up as I was handling it. And it all ended up becoming very, very fine material. So I've got all this really nice fine, almost as fine as the stuff that I run through the screen. In fact, when I was pulling this leafy material out, I was running it through my screen first before placing it in this bucket for storage. So what came through the screen was even finer stuff, and excluding most of the stems. But it's so nice to see how once this stuff dries up a little bit, you can just kind of crunch it around in your hands a little bit, and it all becomes a real fine material like you see here. And it's not just big, huge leaves like we've been seeing in my leaf collection supply. Because at that point, this stuff was still, moist enough that it would stay together. Here now, these leaves have finally dried to the point where they kind of just shatter by being touched and break into little tiny fragments. So we're left with a bedding material that's much finer than it had been previously. So those are the old coffee filters. We'll give them replacements, brand new ones, when we cover up. Before we can cover up, we've got to give them their little meal here. So this is not part of a salad. These are other things. So there's a variety of stuff in here. Some of the stuff, when I saw the large chunks of salad or lettuce, I assumed that most of it had been from the preparation of a salad. But like here too, you can see the stem end of some sort of vegetable that was more likely used for soup. I'm starting to wonder if this stuff might have come from my mom's house. I believe it probably did. Or it might even be a combination of stuff that I threw in the bag alongside things I received from my mom. So it's kind of a big mishmash. I don't go to really great pains to keep things segmented. This stuff all just seemed like it would be good as a good feeding, because although it might not seem like much, I've also got a little bit of coffee to give them. But you know what, before we drop in the coffee and maybe a little bit of my worm chow, I'm going to plop on some crushed eggshell. And I almost forgot, we've got to return all these leftovers back down into the feeding area too. Apple, I don't know, did we bump into a half of an apple over on this one? I figured we would, and I think we did, and here it is. And all this moldy bread. I'm not going to go to any effort here to break up the moldy bread either, because I'm just going to send half of it into the air, which is not what I want to do. I'm going to put it right back down for the worms to break down into smaller bits over time. And I don't know if you've ever handled one of these avocado pits, you'll know that those things are tough. So you wouldn't expect that I'd be able to just press my two fingers together here and crack it. But believe it or not, I could feel the two sides of it deforming and bending in, because even after just 10 days in the worm bin, stuff is really starting to break down quite nicely. So I don't know, is it too late? No, I don't think it is. I just felt like we would be a little bit more generous here with the bedding, and maybe even sprinkle the top of the food with a little bit more. And oh geez, I almost forgot about the coffee too. Don't want to forget about doing away with the coffee. So we got a nice little bedding layer there in between the kitchen scrap type food and now the coffee type food. All right, have we been fair? Both systems get an equal amount? Ooh, yeah, I believe so. So even though it was a somewhat meager assortment of veggie scraps, I think with the nice big boost of bedding with all those leaves, as well as this nice big pile of coffee on top, I think we're giving them a nice little treat that they should probably really enjoy. And even this, blending in some of this leafy material to go hand in hand with the coffee that's surrounding it, I bet that's going to be pretty well received too. So it's kind of interesting how the worms definitely seem to be tending to the feeding area. I guess not too surprising, but in most of my bins, the feeding area is not necessarily where the all the worms are going to be. Sometimes they just find another section of the bin, quite possibly as far away from the feeding area as possible, where they decide to all hang out. So you kind of get into the feeding area, expect to see a whole bunch of worms, and to your surprise, what you really end up encountering is the majority of the worms being someplace completely removed from where the feeding had been placed most recently. So I never really know what to expect in terms of where to encounter the worms. Although here I guess we came back soon enough after the last feeding that there were pretty abundant leftovers and a pretty good number of worms hanging out in and around the leftovers and the feeding area. So I think we've managed to level things off pretty nicely here. Here we are. I've got these 2 coffee filters on standby to replace the kind of worn ones that were in here already. They could have gone another round, I'm sure, but sometimes you just got to do away with stuff because it's piling up and it's time to get composted. These top coverings of newspaper are also holding up quite nicely. A lot of times the worms come up and nibble away at the top coverings that I put out for them. Other times the top coverings seem to survive weeks and weeks longer than I would have anticipated. So maybe that's just a sign that we're giving them sufficiently abundant bedding down in the worm bin so that they're satisfied with what they're getting down there in terms of a carbon food source, and they don't feel compelled to nibble away at the top coverings. Although you got to admit, with the plastic coverings over everything, forcing the recirculation of all the moisture, you got to assume that a good bit of the moisture that's available in the bin to the worms is to be found right there on the top surface, right beneath the plastic. And just as a result of worms coming for that moisture, the top covering paper gets a great deal of traffic. So I'm sure it's just a matter of time before they start working down that top covering newspaper. So that's it now for our check-in with the 52-day-old African nightcrawler worm bins. These are the worms that used to all live together in one single bin marked with this sticker. I was thinking maybe I can cut the sticker in half and put half on each bin so that I know that these are the worms I got from Northeast Worms. Perhaps I'll do that after I turn off the camera. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.